Hi, this is going to be part 4 of sleep deprivation and gangstalking. I want to spend a little time talking about how I believe it's done. I do know that it is done with smartphones. I just don't know the exact method that they use, or the mechanism, I guess. I described in that first video of this series, in that scenario, that these guys were sitting there near the target waiting for some kind of signal on their phones so that they could time their noise, even their movements, to it. My first hypothesis as to how this is done is that perhaps these guys are listening to some kind of, they're part of some kind of voice chat, or, they've got someone on like a call or something like that. Maybe think of it as like a dispatcher, or someone who's managing all of the people who are in the rotation, waiting nearby to where I sleep for their turn to carry out one of these 4 steps. And just to reiterate that, you have the wake up, you have the reveal, which is them, without even you moving, them letting you know that they know you're awake. Shortly after you fully regain consciousness, the third one is toying with you, such as, when you roll over on another side, or if you scratch your knee, twitch your toe, blink your eyes, that type of thing. And then finally the DOI, like I described previously, my term for a kind of a modern version of Chinese water torture, where they're on remote neural monitoring and they're waiting for that exact moment that you're about to drift off to time, so they can time a noise to that. It's much more effective psychologically and physically than just simply waking someone up at a random time, or just keeping them up with random noises. So perhaps there is a kind of a dispatcher who's got, say, maybe 6 guys waiting for their turn to do one of these 4 steps. I guess this kind of fits under the same hypothesis. Could also be, they could be communicating to such a dispatcher maybe by text. The problem that I have with this first hypothesis, though, is that their actions and their sounds are so precisely timed, not just at night, but in another thing I'm going to be getting into, which is what they use remote neural monitoring for in the daytime. Ways to torment you in the daytime, and at night it's usually 1 or 2 people at a time, but in the daytime you might have dozens of people, dozens of incidents with people. And I don't know, it's just hard for me to believe that they could handle in a kind of a one-on-one way, as if you're talking to an operator or something. It's doubtful to me that they can handle that many people at once. And also, because things are timed so precisely, like I said, it just seems like a voice command or even a text message is just not fast enough. They could use code words, could just simply say, okay now, and that's fast enough, but I may be overthinking, but this first hypothesis is not my favorite. Second hypothesis is that if we can go back to our scenario and look at our garbage truck driver, he's waiting in the cabin of his truck nearby to where the target sleeps, where I sleep, and instead of having a voice that says okay now, he's waiting for some kind of notification on his phone, which is a little bit, it's like more instant, and because you're not, instead of having someone else in a different location watching the readout from remote neural monitoring and saying okay now, it's like there's a middleman there, you know what I mean? They can eliminate the middleman and just have our garbage truck driver in the scenario just get get a signal instantly on his phone, such as a ringtone, a beep. Perhaps the phone vibrates, perhaps the screen lights up. We've taken out the middleman who has to take the time to send a text, however short, or has to take the time to give a voice command, however short as well. So it is an interesting concept, I guess, whether or not guys such as these two in my scenario from video 1, whether they themselves have been given access to this technology individually through their phones, or whether they're connected to someone who has that access. And like I said before, because during the day, people using this remote neural monitoring or something like that, it can number in the dozens, and most of them are all just regular civilians. It seems that they've given access out to people, and the implications of that, I think, are huge. But, like they say, as long as this stuff is focused on the target, no problem. Someday, in their eternal witch hunt, they may decide that they want some more witches. That's all I'm saying. My third hypothesis about how this is done is that they're looking at some kind of, on their phone screens, they're looking at some kind of graphical interface. There's something graphically represented. I don't know, maybe they're looking at a readout of some kind that represents something that gets picked up through remote neural monitoring. I don't know. You might ask, like I said earlier, well, when this first started happening to me, I was convinced it was cameras. But when, you're wrapped up in a blanket, in a tarp, behind a bush, how are they able to see, if you're in total darkness, how can they see your eyelids blink? Unless it's some kind of infrared. But as I said earlier, I think in the last video, I tried this in various locations where there weren't cameras already set up. So I do believe it's remote neural monitoring, but this third hypothesis again is that they're looking at some kind of graphical representation that tells them when to do what. And or perhaps they decide what to do. They use their kind of negative creativity to think of different ways to tweak the torture and everything like that. And the only reason I even have this third hypothesis in the first place is that because I've seen so many compelling indications, both at night and in the daytime when they do these other techniques I'm going to get into. I've seen so many compelling indications that they are looking at something on their screens which is telling them when to either move or make a noise. What could it be? Is it like an app? I guess it would have to be a secret app, or it would have to be disguised as something else, and you would go to the app store and download something, and you wouldn't know what it was unless you were told by someone, Or perhaps what they have is, what they're doing is they're going to a specific website through the browsers on their phones. But as far as these compelling indications, I can give you an example from last year. Early one morning, a group of guys was going through the 4 steps with me, keeping me up, and I just happened to be lying in a certain way, lying down in a certain way, and my tarp was open to the south, and so I could actually see these guys about 50 feet away, banging on a dumpster. And each noise was completely synchronized in the way that I previously described, the ways that I previously described, and I was able to catch a very brief but fascinating glimpse of this, secretive gang stalking activity. Just the briefest little glimpse as I, kind of lay there looking south through the open end of this tarp. And I actually focused on, in this group of guys, there was a guy on the left, or on my left, and he had his back to me. He had his phone in his left hand, his smartphone in his left hand, which he never took his eyes off of. And in his right hand he had a kind of a stick or a pole. It looked like the handle of a plunger. And when I saw him, never taking his eyes off that phone, he was slowly leaning backwards with it and extending his right hand out, getting ready to whack the dumpster. And that's, of course, the exact noise that they were using to keep me up that particular night. I want to say it was like maybe October of last year. Now, if my glimpse had ended there, that still would have been very informative, right? I mean, one could, unless I'm overthinking this, one could, say that he was waiting for that kind of a signal. Somebody was looking at something on his phone that was going to tell him the exact moment to whack that dumpster. But what happened was, he was leaning back in the way that I described, with, the handle in one hand and the smartphone in the left, never taking his eyes off of it. And all of a sudden, he stood up straight, dropped his phone to his side, and briskly walked away. So I basically saw two things in this very compelling little glimpse. One, that he was getting ready to synchronize a noise, and he was looking at something on his smartphone screen that was telling him this. And then it seems that whatever he was looking at on his smartphone screen told him, hey, wait a second, he can see you, get out of there. Now, once again, I mean, am I underestimating people's texting abilities? Perhaps whoever he was in communication with, or whatever program he was in communication with, there was simply a message that said, leave. It doesn't have to be fancy. But instances like that, which have happened both at night and the day, have led me to seriously consider that third hypothesis as to how exactly this is done.